Now, joining us to discuss the big topic in Australian politics at the moment is Labor MP Matt Thistlethwaite. Matt, thank you so much for your time. The first most important story we're addressing today is about aged care. This report yesterday said that there were some absolutely shocking conditions that older Australians are having to live in. In particular, this morning we've had trouble getting the Aged Care Minister Richard Colbeck and the Health Minister Greg Hunt to speak on this report. Do you think that's good enough?
That is completely unacceptable, Annalise. This report is quite damning and shocking. And to have so many Australians that have worked so hard for this country, vulnerable Australians that have served our nation in this shocking situation is completely unacceptable. And the government needs to work as quickly as it possibly can to rectify the issues that have been identified by the Aged Care Royal Commission interim report. And if they do so, they'll get Labor's bipartisan support. We just want them to do something. Like a lot of policy areas, they need to come up with a plan and we'll work with them.
The interesting thing to see is that the Prime Minister this morning has said in a radio interview that there will be extra financial support this morning, that there will be extra funding for aged care. But it is also interesting to see Richard Colbeck say he was shocked by some of the findings from the interim report. This has been going for quite some time, this Royal Commission, and it's also preceded by 18 different other investigations into the aged care sector.
Well, Annalise, any local MP will tell you that there's problems with the aged care system because we get the complaints from our constituents who are trying to work through what is a difficult system, and we get the stories that have been highlighted in the Royal Commission. I have to say that the Prime Minister ripping $1.2 billion out of the aged care system when he was the Treasurer hasn't helped. It's certainly one of the issues that's been identified by the Royal Commissioners, the lack of funding, particularly for home care packages. The issues associated with chemical restraint, they all need to be addressed, and they can be addressed quickly if the government brings legislation or brings forward funding for these issues to fix them, and we'll give them bipartisan support. But we've been saying for a long time that cutting the funding unfortunately has led to situations such as this.
Some aged care industry groups have said that it would take $500 million a year to cut waiting lists for aged care facilities to zero. Do you think that that would be worth the government eating into its budget surplus to do that?
Well, look, we'll certainly work through the recommendations, and we've said we're happy to work with the government on a bipartisan basis. But the Royal Commission has recognised that there needs to be additional funding, particularly to reduce the home care waiting list, which is now blown out to about 120,000 Australians on that waiting list. So if additional funding is needed, and we certainly think that it is, then Labor will support something like that. But the government's been in office for 6 years. They cut funding to the sector. Now they have to deal with the consequences, but they need to develop a plan. They need to come to the Parliament in the next couple of weeks when we go back and outline to the Parliament and the Australian people what their plan is, and they'll get support from the Labor Party to do that.
In fairness, though, the waiting list, it hasn't blown out to 120,000. It's actually decreased from 170,000 to 120,000. So isn't that something that the government has shown that they are making progress?
Well, when Labor was in office, it was around 80,000. It's now up around 120,000. The government did commit some additional funding in a recent budget for that, but it wasn't new funding. It was taking funding from other areas within aged care, and that's the problem, Annalise. You need to look at this as a whole area where there needs to be additional support. We've got an ageing population. You've got a system that's under pressure. You've got workers that are working in this system that in some cases are being not paid commensurate with the skills that they have. There's a whole host of issues that need to be dealt with in this sector. We've been saying this for some years now, and we're willing to work with the government to fix it, but they just need to develop a plan and bring that to the Parliament.
Now, one of the other issues that's been bubbling away this week has been this accusation. Well, actually, we can't call it an accusation. Woolworths has admitted that they were underpaying their staff quite an extraordinary sum. And do you think this is symptomatic of a greater issue within Australia? It's not the first case of underpayment that we've seen come out from a major company.
Unfortunately, Annalise, I do think it is. Credit to Woolworths at least for coming forward and saying they made a mistake, but that doesn't forgive them. A large corporation like Woolworths should know better and should have the payroll systems in place to ensure that these situations don't occur. Labor's calling for some form of parliamentary inquiry because it appears that this is happening a lot, Annalise, in the service sector, particularly in hospitality. So we think that we need to look at why it's occurring in this particular industry and get to the bottom of it. Many of the employers are saying that they think that the awards are too complicated. That's complete rubbish. They're now called modern awards and the number of them has been dramatically reduced and they've actually been simplified. So there's no excuse for the industry to blame the award system. They're the ones that have the legal obligation under Australian laws to read awards, and that's all it is. It's all a matter of reading the document, comprehending it, and putting the payroll systems in place to ensure that you abide by them. It's all on their head, and they need to work out what needs to change in their payroll systems to make sure that they comply with our laws.
And just finally, there was a quite well circulated piece by Claire O'Neill yesterday, a speech she gave, but she leaked some of those details to the newspaper with her criticisms of Labor, saying that the Progressives were talking down to people, that they weren't treating them with respect, and that was one of the reasons Labor lost the election. Do you think she's preempting this review? Should she have kept her comments to herself?
Oh, look, I welcome the fact that in the wake of the election loss, there's been numerous MPs and others who've commented on where they think Labor went wrong, what they believe we can do to fix the situation. That's welcomed. You know, Labor's always been the party of ideas and trying to move the country forward. So I welcome the fact that Claire and Jim and others have been making comments. The review will come down next week. My view is after the review, we just got to get on with it. We've got to make sure that we get back out in the community, we're listening to people, we're understanding what their issues are. In my community, I've been doing some door knocking over the last couple of weeks. People are certainly telling me that families are under a lot of pressure, predominantly because of low wages growth and rising electricity costs. The pensioners are feeling left behind, particularly because of low interest rates at the moment, and they're not feeling the love that the Treasurer says is around at the moment in the Australian community and the Australian economy. So they want this government to develop a plan, and we're going to try and hold the government to account on that.
So what do you make of Claire O'Neill's comment then? Were Progressives talking down to traditional Labor voters?
Oh, look, I sort of understand what Claire's saying. I think that there was a perception that was spread by some in our community that because Labor supported marriage equality and other issues in the past, that people felt that they'd been sidelined. But I don't think that is the case in reality, because if you look at the marriage equality vote, most of the coalition MPs supported that as well. So we'll work through all of those issues, and in the wake of this review that's being released next week, we'll make sure that over the course of the next couple of years we listen to the Australian community and that we develop a set of policies that we believe will move the nation forward and hopefully give us a greater prospect of winning at the next election.
Well, we all look forward to that report coming out next week. Matt Thistlethwaite, thank you so much for your time.